We'll take a look at what's happening across the world, and we go to Germany, which has been gradually easing restrictions in the hope that life can have a semblance of normalcy there. So how is that happening? As we hear, children are even beginning to go to school. Thomas Sparrow is political correspondent with our partners DW. He joins us from home in Germany with more. Hi Thomas, it's good to have you as usual. Now let's start with our conversation with a look at the measures to ease restrictions and how they are playing out essentially.
Nice to be with you, Gifty, and hello to all over there. And in fact, as you say, Germany has indeed started a next step of easing of restrictions. In particular, as of this week, certain shops obviously are already open, but museums, galleries, zoos, botanical gardens are also obviously opening, as well as hairdressers. All have to keep certain measures, all have to keep obviously the social distancing and hygiene measures, but as of today they can also open. That's one measure. The other measure we had already mentioned earlier in one of our conversations, namely that schools can gradually start to reopen as well, step by step. That's a very difficult measure because on the one hand you have to guarantee that kids can go back to school and they can be healthy in a school environment, but on the other hand obviously you have to make sure that the school is prepared to actually do so. And that's why in the last few weeks schools across the country have been preparing to make sure that when kids come back step by step, that they can actually be in an environment that is healthy and where they can keep those social distancing and hygiene measures that we've been talking about. So these are the key measures here in Germany. This does not mean that Germany has now left the lockdown completely. In fact, restaurants, bars, discos are still closed. For example, traveling and tourism is still not allowed. So these kinds of measures are still in place, and that gives you an idea of how Germany is doing this step by step, very cautiously. And in fact, Angela Merkel and the regional leaders will meet again on the 6th of May, so on Wednesday, to try and analyze whether the measures have been effective so far. In other words, whether the measures that have been taken in order to ease those restrictions have been followed by a drop in the numbers here in Germany.
And that's exactly where I want to go to. Before I talk about the impact of the ease of restrictions on the rate of infection, Thomas, I'm a bit curious about the schools. It's one of the biggest conversations that we've had here in Ghana. And I just want to find out how are authorities going to ensure that, like you're saying, children can go back to school and that it will be safe for them? What is the plan? If you can break it down for me a little bit.
So the first element of that plan, Gifty, is that not all classes will go back to school at the same time. So the focus, for example, is first and foremost on school leavers, so those pupils who have very important exams. So they are allowed to go back first. That same applies for other classes, but most classes will only have to go back gradually, whether that means going only a few days a week or going only a week at a time or so. The goal is to make sure that all pupils can go back to school in some way or another before the end of the term, in other words, before the summer holidays begin. How that happens is obviously up to regional leaders, up to the regional governments, but in particular what they do have to keep in mind is it has to be gradual, so not all pupils at the same time. They have to make sure that only a certain number of pupils can go into a classroom at a certain period. So for example, you can't have a very large group or a very large class attend a class at the same time. A measure in which they can do that is dividing, for example, classes, or make sure that one class only goes a few days a week and the other class goes later in the week. So that's a key measure. At the same time, making sure that, for example, kids are divided when they have to go to their school breaks. So separating school breaks across the day, or lunch breaks and things like that. So all these very, very important measures to make sure that at no point when a pupil goes to school, he will be surrounded by many, many individuals as well. On the other hand, school authorities have to make sure that those social distancing measures are maintained. So for example, if you see a classroom, you will only see a handful of students separated, only one pupil per desk. That gives you an idea of how this is being implemented, but also, Gifty, an idea of how difficult it is to implement this, because here you have obviously schools that are full normally with a lot of students, a lot of pupils, and as such authorities have had to plan it very carefully how to make sure that those rules and regulations can be followed, while at the same time guaranteeing that the kids can have a proper class when they go back to the classrooms.
Well, we're still trying to figure out what to do with that here, but this sounds like a very difficult one because children are bound to want to, get closer to their friends, especially after being away from each other for a very long time. But we'll see how that goes, Thomas. But let's look also at the easing of restrictions and how it is impacting the rate of infection in Germany. Has it reduced the number of recorded cases, or has it increased it even with a little margin?
That's, Gifty, the question that's actually going to be analysed and discussed this Wednesday, and there's a reason for that. Angela Merkel and regional leaders have found that the best way to realise whether the easing of restrictions have an impact is by analysing in a 2-week period. And that 2-week period, if you count the first restrictions that were eased in April, when, for example, some of the shops were allowed to open, is actually on the 6th of May. So on the 6th of May, they will be able to have 2 weeks of data to analyze whether the opening of shops, the gradual reopening of schools, and I'm talking here also about the planning of that, had some effect in the actual numbers. And we're talking here specifically about not only the numbers of infected, because Germany still has a high number of infected, but that very important number where you can guarantee one person, how many people does that person also infect. We've spoken about this before in this program, that the number has to be 1.0, and Germany had for some time had that around 0.7, meaning that 1 or 10 people only infected 7, meaning that the number was actually gradually going down. And this is something that's going to be very interesting this week to analyze, whether that number has remained like that factor, or whether it has increased, in which case Germany will probably have to reevaluate some of its measures.
Thomas, finally, before you go, talk to us about the search for a vaccine. How is it panning out? Germany was one of the countries we had, was, leading that search. An update, if you may.
Yes, so there are, if you talk about the vaccine, it is important the context here, because Angela Merkel is not the only leader there. Other leaders around the world have stressed that until we have a vaccine, until we have some sort of treatment, the world will have to live with some sort of restriction. In other words, we won't be able to go back to that 100% sense of normality that we had before. So that gives you an idea of why it is so important to look for that vaccine and look for that treatment. Now, there are many projects around the world, many development projects around the world, but only a handful of those projects have entered the sort of clinical trial phase. Here in Germany, you have one of them in the city of Mainz, so in the western part of the country. One institute there is working with another big conglomerate to try and find that vaccine to carry out those clinical trials, and it's only one of a few of these cases that's being carried out in the world. So another one, for example, in the United Kingdom by the University of Oxford is also in the same or at least similar phase, and you have also projects, very similar projects in China and in the United States. Right. So all these are actually trying to focus on finding that vaccination. In particular, when we talk about the case in Germany, that first phase will involve 200 patients that are healthy between 18 and 55. And a second phase would involve patients that are more at risk, to try and identify not only if there are positive results, but also if there are potentially also results that have to be changed or that are not as positive. So that is going to be a process that can take some time. There are officials have said that they want a vaccine to be there until the end of this year, but German officials have been cautioning that that is a long process, that is not something that you can expect to have just in a matter of weeks or months. The experts that I've been following are mentioning that it could be around 12 to 18 months before you have a vaccine that can be used in people, that can be tested with an amount of certainty, which is safe to use. But again, obviously there are different procedures and different processes altogether, so it gives you an idea of how interesting this is, but also how important it is to find a vaccination if indeed we're going to go back to some sort of normality, not only here in Germany but around the world as well, because the goal of German officials is to make any vaccine available to everyone.
Thomas, thank you so much for these updates that you give us weekly. We certainly will come to you on Wednesday for more. Thomas, thank you. Thomas Faris, political correspondent with our partners DW, who joined us all the way from his home where he's working in times of coronavirus. Let's take a look at the worldometer. What is happening on the world scene as far as infections, etc. are concerned? All right, we'll bring that to you. Right now, though, I'm bringing you back home. Vice President Dr. Before you go there, we have it, 3,596,433. That is the number of coronavirus cases, over 3 million that we've recorded so far. And that's the number of people that have died, 249,469. That's 249,469. Stay safe, wear your masks, keep washing your hands, and if it's possible, stay home. Also, over 1 million people have recovered, which is also a good thing.